For most of human history, we weren't alone. If you could travel back 50,000 years, you'd find a world where several different kinds of humans were alive at the same time. Some looked a lot like us. Others were built completely differently, shorter, heavier, shaped by climates and landscapes that would be brutal for a modern person. One human species lived on a remote island and evolved to barely 3 feet tall. Another was so mysterious that almost everything we know about them came from a single finger bone. And then there was us, Homo sapiens. Today, we're the only human species left. Not because we were the strongest, smartest, or even the oldest. We're just the ones who are still here. And that raises a question without an easy answer. What happened to everyone else? The truth was slower and messier. To understand what happened, you have to start with the species that lasted the longest, Homo erectus. Homo erectus appeared around 2 million years ago. To put that into perspective, everything modern humans have ever built, every city, every war, every language, fits into just a tiny fraction of that time. Homo erectus existed for so long that our entire history looks like a footnote beside theirs. Their bodies were the first to look recognizably human. They had long legs, shorter arms, and a frame built for walking and running across open ground. They were almost certainly the first human species to leave Africa and spread into other parts of the world. That meant learning to survive in environments they had never evolved for. Their brains were smaller than ours, but much larger than anything that came before them. They also developed stone tools that barely changed for hundreds of thousands of years. That might sound like a lack of imagination, but it was probably the opposite. Their tools worked so well that there wasn't much pressure to change them. But by their final chapter, the world was changing around them. Their last population survived on the Indonesian island of Java, cut off from the mainland with nowhere new to go. The forests they had hunted in began shrinking. The animals they depended on became harder to find. And without enough people or enough space to recover, a species that had survived for nearly 2 million years slowly ran out of options. Their last fossils date to around 110,000 years ago. After surviving almost everything the planet could throw at them, Homo erectus was gone. Now let's talk about the Neanderthals, probably the most misunderstood humans in history. For decades, they were portrayed as dim, brutish cavemen. That picture was wrong, and the more we discover about them, the more wrong it becomes. Neanderthals were built for survival in ways that are hard to overstate. Their bodies were compact and powerful, with wide chests, thick bones, and strong arms. They had heavy brow ridges and large noses that helped warm cold air before it reached their lungs. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. They hunted large and dangerous animals at close range, which may explain why their skeletons show injury patterns similar to modern rodeo riders. They controlled fire, made sophisticated tools, and there's growing evidence that they buried their dead with care. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia for more than 300,000 years. Then, around 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began moving into the same regions. For several thousand years, the two species lived side by side, and DNA evidence shows they even had children together. But living alongside Homo sapiens created new problems. Both species hunted many of the same animals and depended on the same land. Homo sapiens tended to live in larger groups and maintain wider social networks, allowing information, resources, and support to travel farther. Neanderthals generally lived in smaller, more isolated groups, which made it harder to recover when things went badly. And the climate wasn't helping. Cold periods and warmer periods repeatedly reshaped the environment. Neanderthal populations became smaller and more isolated, and their DNA suggests they were already dealing with very low genetic diversity. By around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record. They weren't necessarily wiped out by one dramatic event. Instead, competition, climate change, and shrinking populations may have slowly pushed them toward extinction. Now let's talk about the Denisovans. They're different from almost every other human species because we can barely see them in the archaeological record. The entire discovery started with a single finger bone found inside a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a fragment so small it could fit in your palm. But when scientists extracted DNA from it, something unexpected happened. It didn't match Neanderthals. It didn't match Homo sapiens. It didn't match any known human population. It was something else entirely. A previously unknown branch of the human family had been hiding in the genetic record all along. Since then, only a handful of additional remains have been discovered, including some teeth and part of a jawbone found high on the Tibetan plateau. That's almost nothing. And yet their genetic shadow is enormous. Denisovan ancestry appears in modern populations across parts of Asia and Oceania. Some Melanesian groups carry as much as 6% Denisovan DNA. Tibetans inherited a Denisovan gene called EPAS1, which helps them function at extreme altitudes where most people's bodies would struggle. Think about how strange that is. A species we can barely find in the ground is still influencing how living humans survive in thin air. But as a living population, the Denisovans eventually faded away, somewhere around 30,000 years ago. Their range may have been huge, but their numbers were probably small. And small populations don't have much room for error when the world around them starts changing. Then there's one of the strangest chapters in human history. In 2003, researchers working on the Indonesian island of Flores discovered the remains of a human species unlike anything they had seen before. They stood only about a meter tall and had brains roughly the size of a grapefruit. At first, many scientists weren't convinced. Some argued that the bones belonged to modern humans with a disease or developmental condition. But as more evidence appeared, it became clear that these remains belonged to a separate species, Homo floresiensis. This tiny human lived on Flores alongside Komodo dragons, giant storks, and dwarf elephants. Islands can push evolution in strange directions. When populations remain isolated for long periods, they can change dramatically. Large animals can become smaller, while small animals can become larger. Homo floresiensis may be one of the most remarkable examples of this in the entire human family. Their fossils date from roughly 100,000 to 60,000 years ago, while stone tools suggest they may have survived until around 50,000 years ago. And here's what makes the timing interesting. Modern humans were arriving in the region at roughly the same time. We don't know exactly what happened, but on a small island, a species doesn't need some massive catastrophe to disappear. Sometimes a small population facing new pressures simply runs out of time. So why are we the only human species left? The obvious answer is intelligence, but that explanation falls apart pretty quickly. Neanderthals were intelligent. Denisovans adapted to extreme environments. Homo erectus survived for almost 2 million years, and Homo floresiensis survived conditions that would terrify a modern human. What may have separated us was something much harder to measure: the way we built connections across distance. Homo sapiens didn't just live in groups. We built networks. Tools, techniques, ideas, and knowledge could move between communities, sometimes across enormous distances. When one group faced a crisis, what they learned didn't necessarily disappear with them. That knowledge could already have traveled somewhere else. And when the climate changed and entire regions became difficult or impossible to live in, our species could reorganize. We weren't locked into one place or one strategy. But even that doesn't explain everything. Luck mattered. Geography mattered. Being in the right place with enough people at the right moment mattered too. We weren't destined to become the last human species. We just happened to be the ones who survived. The other human species weren't unfinished versions of us. They weren't simply steps on the way to Homo sapiens. They were their own kinds of humans, each with their own way of surviving in the world. Homo erectus survived for nearly 2 million years and still disappeared. Neanderthals endured hundreds of thousands of years of changing ice age climates and still vanished. The Denisovans left behind almost no fossils, yet traces of their DNA are still inside people living today. For most of human history, we were just one branch of a much larger family. Now, we're the only one left,